Millionaire kid got hurt playing alone. His twin found help from poor mechanic who had no idea. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Blackwood estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, its golden rays illuminating the manicured gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Behind the towering iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges lived two 8-year-old boys who shared everything except their parents. Attention! Oliver and Oscar Blackwood were identical twins, mirror images of each other with sandy blonde hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled with mischief. But while they looked exactly the same, their worlds couldn't have been more different. Oliver was the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take over the family's billion-dollar empire. He attended private tutoring sessions, formal dinners, and board meetings where he sat quietly, learning the weight of responsibility that would one day rest on his small shoulders. Oscar, born just 12 minutes after his brother, lived in Oliver's shadow. He was the spare, the backup plan, the one who could disappear for hours without anyone noticing. While Oliver practiced piano and studied business fundamentals, Oscar explored the forgotten corners of their massive estate, befriending the gardeners and kitchen staff who actually had time to listen to his stories. On this particular Saturday morning, their parents, Richard and Victoria Blackwood, had flown to New York for an emergency board meeting. The nanny had called in sick, and the housekeeper was busy preparing for a charity gala that evening. For once, the boys were truly alone in their gilded cage. Oliver stood at the edge of the estate's man-made lake, skipping stones across the perfectly still water. He had perfected the technique weeks ago, but today felt different. Today, he wanted to try something bigger, something that would prove he was more than just a carefully controlled heir. He eyed the old rope swing that hung from a massive oak tree, its frayed edges telling stories of adventures past. The rope swing had been installed years ago by the previous owners, back when the estate was a family home rather than a fortress of wealth. It dangled about 15 feet above the water, and the gardeners had been instructed to remove it multiple times, but somehow it always remained, as if it belonged to the soul of the place rather than its owners. Oliver had watched. Oscar used the swing dozens of times, always from the safety of the shore. His brother would run, leap, and soar through the air with complete abandon, landing with a splash that echoed across the water, but Oliver had never tried it himself. There were always lessons to attend, appearances to maintain, expectations to fulfill, but not today. He climbed the gentle slope to the launching point, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. The rope felt rough in his small hands, older and more worn than he had expected. He wrapped his fingers around it, testing its strength, feeling the history in its fibers. This was freedom, this was childhood, this was everything he had been. Denied in his structured world. Oscar was in the garden maze on the other side of the estate, completely absorbed in his own adventure. He had discovered a family of rabbits that had made their home in the maze's center, and he was carefully building them a small shelter from fallen branches and leaves. He had no idea that his brother was about to make a decision that would change everything. Oliver took a deep breath, backed up several steps, and ran toward the edge of the slope. His feet left the ground, and for a moment, he felt what it was like to fly. The wind rushed through his hair, the lake sparkled below him, and he understood why Oscar loved this feeling so much. This was what it meant to be a child, to feel alive, to exist in a moment without consequences. But the rope, weakened by years of weather and neglect, had been waiting for this moment. As Oliver reached the peak of his arc, the ancient fibers gave way. The snap echoed across the water like a gunshot, and suddenly he was falling, not in a graceful dive, but in a tumbling, helpless plummet. He hit the water hard, his small body crashing through the surface with a sickening splash. But worse than the water was what lay beneath it. The lake's edge was lined with decorative rocks, and Oliver's shoulder struck one of them with a force that sent shockwaves of pain through his entire body. He surfaced, gasping and crying, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It radiated from his shoulder through his chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything but cry out for help. But the estate was vast, and he was alone. His voice, usually so controlled and measured, became a raw, desperate sound that seemed to disappear into the manicured wilderness around him. He managed to drag himself to the shore, his good arm doing all the work while his injured shoulder screamed in protest. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his head, and his face was pale with shock and pain. The perfectly pressed polo shirt he had chosen that morning was now torn and stained with lake water and blood from scrapes he hadn't even noticed. Oliver tried to stand, but the world spun around him. The pain in his shoulder was getting worse, not better, and he could feel something was very wrong. He had never broken a bone before, never been seriously injured, never experienced anything beyond the minor scrapes and bruises that came with a carefully supervised childhood. This was different. This was real. This was scary. He called out again, his voice cracking with pain and fear. But the estate seemed to swallow his cries, the perfectly manicured grounds offering no comfort, no relief. He was alone with his pain, alone with his fear, alone in a way that no 8-year-old should ever be. Meanwhile, Oscar had finished his rabbit shelter and was making his way back toward the main house. He walked slowly, in no hurry to return to the quiet emptiness that usually filled their home. He was humming to himself, a tune he had heard one of the gardeners singing. When he heard something that made his blood run cold, it was crying, not just any crying, but the kind of desperate, pain-filled sobs that could only come from someone who was truly hurt. And he recognized that voice. It was Oliver. Oscar dropped the flowers he had picked for the housekeeper and ran toward the sound. His small legs pumped as fast as they could carry him, his heart pounding with fear for his brother. Despite their different lives, despite the way their parents treated them differently, despite all the complicated dynamics of their family, Oliver was his twin, his other half, his best friend when no one else was watching. He found Oliver sitting by the lake's edge, cradling his injured arm and crying in a way that Oscar had never seen before. Oliver, who was always composed, always in control, always the perfect heir, was broken and scared and desperately in need of help. Oscar knelt beside his brother, his own eyes filling with tears at the sight of Oliver's pain. He could see immediately that something was very wrong with Oliver's shoulder, the way it sat at an odd angle, the way Oliver couldn't move his arm without crying out in agony. Oscar knew he had to get help, but from where? Their parents were in New York. The nanny was sick. The housekeeper was busy and wouldn't hear them from this distance. The gardeners had gone home for the weekend. They were alone on their vast estate, 2 8-year-old boys with no adults to turn to. But Oscar remembered something. Earlier that morning, while exploring the far edges of the estate, he had seen a small auto repair shop just beyond their property line. It was run down and modest, nothing like the gleaming world they lived in, but there had been lights on and the sound of someone working. Someone who might help. He explained his plan to Oliver, who was in too much pain to argue. Oscar helped his brother to his feet, and together they began the slow, painful journey across the estate toward the property line. Oliver leaned heavily on his twin, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his injured shoulder. They walked through gardens that cost more to maintain than most people made in a year, past sculptures and fountains that were works of art, through a world of beauty and privilege that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. All that mattered was getting help for Oliver, getting to someone who could make the pain stop. As they reached the edge of their property, Oscar could see the small auto repair shop more clearly. It was a modest building with a hand-painted sign that read Murphy's Auto Repair. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, and the building itself looked like it had seen better days. But there was a light on in the garage, and the sound of someone working on a car engine gave Oscar hope. This was their only chance. This stranger, this person from a world completely different from their own, was their only hope of getting help for Oliver. Oscar took a deep breath, tightened his grip on his brother's good arm, and led them toward the shop. Neither boy had any idea that they were about to meet someone who would change their lives forever, someone whose connection to their family ran deeper than they could possibly imagine. They were just two scared children, looking for help in a world that suddenly felt very big and very dangerous. The first chapter of their story was ending, but the real adventure was just beginning. Jake Murphy wiped his grease-stained hands on an even greasier rag and stepped back to admire his work. The 1987 Chevy pickup truck that had been giving him trouble all morning was finally purring like a contented cat. At 42, Jake had been fixing cars for over 20 years, and he took pride in bringing broken things back to life. His small shop might not look like much from the outside, but every vehicle that rolled out of his garage ran better than the day it was built. Shop was his sanctuary, filled with the familiar smells of motor oil and metal, the comforting sounds of engines and tools. It was also his refuge from a world that hadn't always been kind to him. Jake had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, never quite belonging anywhere. Cars had been his constant companions, the one thing he could understand and control when everything else in his life felt chaotic. He had opened Murphy's Auto Repair 5 years ago with his life savings and a dream of building something that would last. The location wasn't prime real estate, sandwiched between a struggling diner and a vacant lot, across from one of the most exclusive estates in Greenwich. But the rent was affordable, and Jake had learned to make do with what he had. Irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days fixing the broken-down cars of working-class families, while living in the shadow of wealth beyond his imagination. The Blackwood estate loomed across the street like a monument to everything he would never have. But Jake didn't resent the inequality. He had found peace in his simple life, satisfaction in his honest work, and purpose in helping people who, like him, couldn't afford to take their cars to the fancy dealerships in town. On this particular Saturday, Jake was working alone. His part-time helper had called in sick, and he was enjoying the solitude. He had his radio tuned to classic rock, a pot of coffee brewing in the corner, and a challenging transmission rebuild that would keep him busy for hours. It was exactly the kind of day he loved. Just him, his tools, and the meditative rhythm of mechanical work. He was deep under the hood of the pickup when he heard voices outside. Not the usual voices of his customers, but something different, younger, distressed. He paused, listening more carefully, and realized it was children talking. That was unusual. His shop wasn't in a neighborhood where kids typically played, and it was rare for anyone under 16 to show up at his door. Jake emerged from under the hood and walked toward the open garage door. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. 2 small boys were standing at the edge of his parking lot, and one of them was clearly in serious trouble. The child was pale, his clothes soaked, and his left arm was hanging at an angle that made Jake's stomach turn. He had seen enough injuries in his life to know a broken bone when he saw one. But what struck him most was how lost and scared they looked. These weren't the rough and tumble kids from his neighborhood. Their clothes, even soaked and torn, spoke of money and privilege. Their haircuts were perfect, their shoes expensive. They looked like they had stepped out of a magazine, except for the pain and fear etched on their faces. The injured boy was trying to be brave, but Jake could see the tears streaming down his cheeks. The other boy, who looked identical to the first, was holding his brother's good arm and talking to him in low, comforting tones. There was something about the way they stood together, supporting each other, that reminded Jake of himself and his own brother all those years ago. Jake approached them slowly, not wanting to startle them. Up close, he could see that the injured boy's shoulder was definitely broken and probably dislocated as well. The child needed medical attention immediately, But Jake's first priority was earning their trust. He knelt down to their level, his voice gentle and calm. He introduced himself and asked what had happened. The uninjured boy, Oscar, he learned, explained about the rope swing, the fall, and their desperate search for help. He spoke with the kind of careful politeness that came from expensive, private schools, but underneath the formal language, Jake could hear the raw fear of a child who didn't know what to do. Oliver, the injured boy, was fighting to stay conscious. The pain and shock were taking their toll, and Jake knew they didn't have much time. He needed to get the child to a hospital, but he also needed to contact their parents. When he asked about their family, Oscar explained that their parents were in New York and unreachable. Their nanny was sick, and they were essentially alone. Jake felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. He had seen this before, in different forms. Children left to fend for themselves while the adults in their lives pursued other priorities. It didn't matter if it was neglect born of poverty or privilege. The result was the same. Kids got hurt, and they deserved better. But anger wouldn't help these boys. Action would. Jake quickly made a decision. He would drive them to the hospital himself. His truck was clean and reliable, and the hospital was only 10 minutes away. He could have them there faster than an ambulance could arrive, and every minute mattered when dealing with a serious injury. He helped Oliver into the passenger seat of his truck, being careful not to jostle the injured arm. Oscar climbed into the middle, staying close to his brother. Jake adjusted the mirrors, buckled their seatbelts, and started the engine. As they pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't help but glance at the massive estate across the street. Somewhere behind those gates was a world of unimaginable wealth, but it had failed to protect these two small boys when they needed it most. The drive to the hospital was tense. Oliver was slipping in and out of consciousness, and Oscar was trying to keep him awake by talking about their adventures, their pets, their plans for the summer. Jake listened to their conversation and began to piece together their story. They were clearly from the Blackwood family. He had seen their name on the estate's mailbox countless times. But they were also just two scared kids who needed help. At the hospital, Jake carried Oliver into the emergency room while Oscar stayed close by his side. The medical staff immediately recognized the severity of the injury and whisked Oliver away for x-rays and treatment. Jake stayed with Oscar in the waiting room, filling out forms and answering questions as best he could. It was then that Jake learned something that would change everything. While talking to Oscar, trying to keep the boy distracted and calm, he asked about their family. Oscar mentioned that their father was Richard Blackwood, the CEO of Blackwood Industries. But then he said something that made Jake's blood run cold. Oscar mentioned that their father had been adopted, that he had grown up in foster care before being adopted by the wealthy Blackwood family as a teenager. He talked about it casually, the way children do when they don't understand the significance of what they're saying. But Jake understood. He understood all too well. Because Jake Murphy had also grown up in foster care. And he remembered a younger boy in one of his foster homes, a boy named Richie, who had been his closest friend during one of the darkest periods of his childhood. They had been separated when Richie got adopted by a wealthy family, and Jake had never seen him again. He had always wondered what had happened to that scared, quiet boy who had shared his bunk bed and his dreams of a better future. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Richard Blackwood, the billionaire CEO living in the mansion across from his modest shop, was Richie from the foster home. His brother, not by blood, but by circumstance, by shared experience, by the bond that forms between children who have no one else in the world. Jake sat in the hospital waiting room, watching Oscar draw pictures on a napkin to pass the time, and felt the weight of 25 years of separation. He had been fixing cars across the street from his foster brother's home for 5 years, never knowing how close they were. And now, in the strangest twist of fate, it was Richard's sons who had brought them back together. The doctor came out to report that Oliver's shoulder was indeed broken and dislocated, but that he would make a full recovery. The injury looked worse than it was, and with proper treatment, he would be back to normal in a few weeks. Jake felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by the realization that he would need to contact Richard and Victoria Blackwood. As Jake prepared to make the call that would reunite him with his foster brother, he looked at Oscar, who was still drawing and humming to himself. The boy had no idea that he had just orchestrated one of the most important reunions in Jake's life. He was just a kid who had done what kids do. He had found help when his brother needed it. But Jake knew better. He knew that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary days. Sometimes the people who change our lives forever are the ones we least expect. And sometimes the help we need most comes from the most unexpected places. As he dialed Richard's number, Jake realized that the broken rope swing that had caused so much pain might also be the thing that finally brought a family back together. Not just Oliver and Oscar, but Jake and Richard as well. Brothers who had been separated by circumstance, reunited by the love and courage of two small boys who refused to give up on each other. The phone rang, and Jake prepared to say the words that would change everything. "Richard, it's Jake. Jake Murphy. I think we need to talk." The second chapter was ending, but Jake knew that the real story was just beginning. A story about family, about loyalty, about the connections that bind us together across time and distance and circumstance. A story about how sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And it all started with two brave boys who refused to let their brother suffer alone.